My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 72 years old, and all I wanted that Friday afternoon was a quiet week by the ocean. I had spent most of my life working double shifts as an ICU nurse, the kind of job that teaches you how fragile a human body can be and how quickly peace can slip through your fingers. After losing my husband 7 years ago, the little beach house in Harbor Point became the one place that still felt like mine, the one corner of the world where I could breathe. So when I turned off the highway and felt the salt wind hit my face, I truly believed I was driving toward rest. I even whispered to myself, just a week, Evelyn, a week of quiet. But the moment my tires rolled into the driveway, my heart dropped. A white contractor's truck blocked half the yard. Sheets of plywood leaned against the railing. I could hear a hammer slamming against something inside, hard, frantic, like the house itself was crying out. I left my bags in the car and walked toward the door, feeling the boards tremble under my feet. When I stepped inside, a stranger in a dust-covered shirt brushed past me without even looking up. The air smelled of sawdust and paint, thick enough to sting my throat. My kitchen, my husband's favorite room, was gutted down to the studs. The countertops were gone. The cabinets were gone. Even the sink had been ripped out, leaving only exposed pipes like bones. I stood there, gripping the doorframe to steady myself, when a familiar voice floated over the noise. "Oh, Evelyn, you're early." My daughter-in-law said it like I was the one intruding. And in that moment, a cold certainty settled in my chest. Something was terribly, dangerously wrong. The moment my daughter-in-law walked away from me, shouting instructions over the roar of drills, I felt a strange numbness settle into my chest. It was the kind of numbness that comes after a hard blow, when your body hasn't quite caught up to the shock. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to blink the dust out of my eyes as I looked around the kitchen that had once been the heart of my home. The floor I used to sweep barefoot in the summer was covered in splintered wood and cardboard. The window that framed every sunset was blocked by a stack of drywall. Somewhere underneath all that noise and mess was the last piece of a life I had shared with my husband, but I could barely recognize any of it. I stepped deeper inside, forcing my feet to move even though my mind kept whispering, "Turn around. Get out. Something is wrong." The thud of hammers echoed through the hallway, rattling the picture frames still hanging on the wall, those they somehow hadn't taken down yet. My husband's smile flashed at me from one of them, the photo of him holding up a fish he caught right off the dock behind the house. I reached up and steadied the frame, my fingers brushing over the glass, as if touching it could somehow anchor me in the middle of the chaos. A cloud of dust rolled through the hallway as I made my way toward the master bedroom. My heart was beating too fast, but I kept going because I needed to see it. That room was sacred ground to me. It was where my husband spent his last good summer. It was where we drank coffee every morning on that silly striped love seat he insisted on keeping, even though it didn't match anything else. I pushed open the door, and the sight inside felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed. The wall facing the ocean had been split open along one side. The wood trim we had chosen together, after arguing for an hour in the hardware store, was gone. The carpet had been ripped up, exposing the subfloor. And the bed was simply missing. The mattress, the frame, the quilt I made the year my granddaughter was born, everything was gone as if it had never belonged there in the first place. Behind me, footsteps approached, and Daniel's voice carried that same blend of impatience and forced cheer he used whenever he knew he'd done something questionable. "Mom, you made it. I thought you'd be here tomorrow." I didn't answer right away because I was busy searching his face for something, remorse, explanation, even a flicker of understanding of what this house meant to me. I didn't find any of it. He stepped inside the room, looked around as if he were giving a tour to a stranger, and said, We're opening this wall up to make room for a bigger master suite. It'll be amazing when it's done." "We?" My voice came out smaller than I intended, and I hated how frail it sounded. "Yeah," he said casually. "Tessa and I. We've been talking about moving out here permanently. It just makes sense. The city's too hectic, and this house is perfect for a family. We've already started planning out the space for the kids, and maybe a room for Tessa's parents down the line." He said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if the home I had worked 40 years to afford was nothing more than a convenient upgrade for them. I felt my stomach twist, a slow burn spreading behind my ribs. I asked him where I was supposed to stay while all this was happening. He smiled, an absent, distracted smile, and motioned for me to follow him down the hallway. I did, because I couldn't make my legs do anything else. We passed the family photos, the linen closet, the spare room I used to knit in, and then he stopped at the very end of the hall. He pushed open a door I rarely used, and the smell of dust and cedar hit me. "This one," he said. "It's small, but it's cozy. And it's quieter back here anyway." Quiet. That was his selling point. The room barely fit a twin bed. There was one tiny window facing the driveway, and the only sound was the distant, muffled banging of construction from the other end of the house. I stepped inside and placed my hand on the cold windowsill. No view of the ocean. No breeze. No trace of the life I had built. Daniel stood in the doorway, checking his phone. "We've already talked to the contractor. They'll finish the new layout in a few weeks. It'll be so much better than the old setup. Mom, trust me." Trust me. The same words he used when he borrowed money and promised he'd pay it back soon. The same words he used when he said he'd help me maintain the house after his father passed, only to disappear for months. I felt a sting behind my eyes, but I refused to let the tears fall. I nodded once, more out of habit than agreement, and he left to rejoin the chaos downstairs. When the door clicked shut behind him, the silence in that tiny room grew heavy, almost suffocating. For the first time in my life, as I stared at my suitcase sitting on the little bed, I felt like a guest in the only place that had ever truly belonged to me, and something deep inside me began to tremble, not from fear, but from the first spark of anger. That night, the little room felt colder than it should have. The thin blanket on the twin bed smelled of storage, like it had been sitting untouched for years. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant thump of construction equipment being loaded into trucks outside. Every sound made the knot in my stomach pull tighter. I hadn't eaten since the drive down, but hunger was the last thing on my mind. When the house finally quieted, the silence didn't bring me comfort. It only left space for the questions I'd been pushing aside since I'd walked in the front door. Why hadn't Daniel told me? How long had they been planning this? When did my home become a project for someone else to redesign? I rolled onto my side, trying to find a comfortable spot on the sagging mattress. And that's when I noticed the thin line of light beneath the closet door. At first I thought I imagined it, but when I sat up, I saw the faint glow again. I pulled myself out of bed and opened the closet slowly. The light came from a small lamp sitting on the top shelf, next to a stack of folders. My name wasn't on them, but something about the way they were tucked away, half hidden under a blanket, made my chest tighten. I reached for the top folder and carried it to the bed. The cheap metal clip at the top was bent, as if someone had yanked it open too many times. I unfastened it, expecting maybe contractor receipts or paint samples. Instead, the first page showed a bold heading that made my pulse spike. Project owner Daniel Carter estimated cost $129,170. There were renderings of rooms I had never approved, lists of materials more expensive than anything I would have chosen, and a schedule laid out across the next 2 months. 2 months? They had rearranged the rest of my spring without even mentioning it. I turned to the next set of documents and felt my breath catch. It wasn't construction paperwork this time. It was a stack of legal forms, pages and pages stamped with the same 3 words. Durable power of attorney. My name was typed neatly at the top of each one. The signature line below it was empty, but there was a sticky note attached in Tessa's handwriting. Just sign here when you're ready. We'll take care of the rest. The exclamation point at the end made me feel sick. I sat very still, holding the page between my hands, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink around me. The walls of that little space, the one they'd assigned me like a child, felt as though they were closing in. I remembered the conversations Daniel and I had had over the past year, moments I had brushed off as harmless. Mom, it would be easier if I handled your insurance paperwork. Mom, maybe we should simplify your accounts, just in case. Mom, you shouldn't have to worry about all this stuff at your age. At your age, I used to hear those words from patients' families when they didn't want their loved ones deciding their own treatment. They cloaked control in concern, made it sound like love when it was really fear or convenience. I never imagined I'd hear it from my own son, let alone see the proof of it sitting in my lap. My hands were shaking by the time I reached for my phone. I didn't want to overreact. I didn't want to rush to conclusions, but I needed someone who understood the law, someone who could look at this mess without the fog of heartbreak clouding their judgment. I scrolled to Martin's name, my husband's friend, our family's attorney for almost 3 decades, and hit call. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy but warm. He offered to turn on a lamp, to sit up. But I told him no. I just needed to get something off my chest. I told him everything. Not dramatically, not with anger. I simply laid out the facts the way I used to give patient reports, clearly, concisely, without letting my voice crack. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line, long enough for me to hear the waves outside my window. Evelyn, he finally said, none of this is legal without your signature. Not the construction, not the financial decisions, and certainly not the power of attorney. His voice took on a sharper edge. They started major renovations without written permission from the owner. That alone is a serious issue. My throat tightened. So what do I do? You don't confront them yet, he said. You document everything, every photo, every sound, every receipt you find. Send me pictures of the paperwork you found, then try to rest. Tomorrow, I'll file a petition with the county for an emergency stop work order, and depending on how things look, we may request a temporary removal from the premises until we sort out who's acting in good faith and who's not. Removal, he meant eviction. The word hung heavy in my mind. Martin must have sensed my hesitation because he added gently, Evelyn, you need to protect yourself. What they're doing isn't a misunderstanding. It's a setup. Maybe not malicious in their minds, but it's dangerous for you. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed with the documents spread around me like the scattered remains of trust. I tried to imagine Daniel's face when he was younger, when he used to sprint down the beach and yell for me to watch him jump the waves. I wondered how that little boy had turned into a man who planned a future inside my home without leaving space for me. A single car drove past outside, its headlights casting a thin diagonal stripe of light across the room. I stared at that stripe for a long time. The anger I'd felt earlier in the day grew into something steadier, something almost cold. They had planned my place in this house. They had chosen the room for me, the paperwork for me, the decisions for me. But they hadn't planned for this. They hadn't planned for me to fight. And I knew, with a clarity that settled deep into my bones, that the next morning would change everything. Morning arrived slowly, a thin gray light slipping through the tiny window of the room Daniel had assigned me. I hadn't slept at all. My mind had been too loud, running in circles around every memory, every warning sign I'd ignored. When I finally stood, my knees cracked, and the cold floor sent a jolt through my legs. I felt older than I had in years, but I also felt more awake than I had in a long time. I spent the early hours moving through the house with my phone in hand, taking photos the way Martin had told me to. The gutted kitchen, the open walls, the stacks of lumber and wiring left across the living room. Every corner looked less like a home and more like a building abandoned mid-disaster. The workers didn't arrive until later in the morning, so for once, the silence belonged to me. I paused in the doorway of the master bedroom. The ocean glimmered beyond the torn drywall. The breeze carried the scent of salt and something faintly metallic. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let myself imagine it the way it once was. Sunlight stretching across the quilt I had sewn. My husband sitting on the edge of the bed tying his shoes, laughing about how he never could keep sand out of them no matter how careful he was. Then I opened my eyes again, and reality came back with a punch. Around mid-morning, I carried a tray of coffee into the living room, not out of courtesy, but because I needed a reason to be near Daniel and Tessa without tipping them off. They were huddled over a laptop, whispering urgently. When they noticed me, they straightened and smiled too quickly. "You don't have to worry about anything, Mom," Daniel said. "We've got everything under control." The words stung, and not for the reasons he thought. I set the tray down carefully, studying their faces. They looked comfortable, at ease, as if they belonged here, as if I were the visitor. Tessa took a mug and brushed dust from her hair. "The contractor said they'll be here in an hour. We're ahead of schedule, actually." "Schedule for what?" I asked softly. She blinked, thrown off by the calmness in my voice. "For the renovation. For making this a home for all of us. All of us." That phrase hit me like a wave breaking too close to shore. They truly believed they were entitled to this place. My place. They had built an entire future inside these walls without leaving room for me to exist in it. I excused myself before my voice could betray me. Back in my small room, I closed the door and leaned against it, letting my breath settle. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Martin. "Submitting the emergency petition now. Should have an update today. Do not confront them yet. Let the process work." I typed back a simple thank you, though what I really wanted to say was that I felt like I was walking through a dream that kept tilting sideways. But I knew he understood. He always had. The hours that followed moved strangely, too fast and too slow at the same time. Workers arrived, only to be told to wait outside. Daniel stepped onto the porch, arguing on the phone about delays. Tessa paced the living room, muttering about budgets and timelines. I stayed quiet in the background, watching them make themselves the center of a house they didn't own. By noon, the sky had darkened with an unexpected storm. The wind off the water whipped sand against the windows, and thunder rumbled somewhere far out at sea. The workers left early, promising to return when the weather cleared. Daniel grumbled for half an hour about wasted time, and then, just after 3 o'clock, it happened. A county vehicle pulled into the driveway, white with a blue stripe and a seal on the door. My heart lurched, not from fear, but from something closer to vindication. Daniel and Tessa looked out the window, confused, as an officer stepped out into the rain with a folder tucked under his arm. He knocked firmly on the door. Daniel answered, forcing a smile. "Can I help you, officer?" "Are you Daniel Carter?" the man asked. "Yes." He handed Daniel the folder. "This is a court-issued stop work order. All construction must cease immediately pending formal review. That includes demolition, remodeling, and any contracted labor. Tessa appeared behind Daniel, her mouth falling open. What? Why? This is our home. The officer shook his head. The owner filed the petition this morning. Daniel's face drained of color as he slowly turned toward me. His disbelief was almost childlike, the way a person looks when the world abruptly stops behaving the way they assumed it would. "Mom," he said quietly, "you did this?" The storm outside cracked loud enough to rattle the windows, but the silence between us felt louder. I stepped forward, careful, steady, holding his gaze. "You started construction on my house without permission," I said. "I needed it to stop." Tessa stepped forward, her voice rising with panic. "We were trying to build something better, for all of us. Why are you making this harder than it has to be?" Another vehicle pulled in, a county inspector. The officer gestured toward the interior. "I need to walk through the property with the homeowner." Daniel blocked the doorway for a moment, anger building behind his eyes, but the officer's posture shifted, and Daniel stepped aside. I moved past him, feeling something shift inside me, not triumph, not satisfaction, something sturdier, a quiet reclaiming of ground that had slowly been slipping away. As the inspector followed me into the house, Daniel called after me, "You're tearing this family apart." I didn't look back, because for the first time in years, I wasn't the one tearing anything apart. I was finally putting something back together. The county inspector moved slowly through each room, his boots leaving narrow prints in the dust that coated the floors. He took photos, measured torn-out sections of drywall, lifted exposed wiring with the tip of his pen as if afraid it might snap under its own weight. I followed quietly behind him, answering questions when he asked, watching Daniel and Tessa standing off to the side like unwelcome guests at their own event. The storm outside had eased into a steady drizzle, but inside the house, the tension felt heavier than the rain. When the inspector knelt beside the open plumbing in the kitchen, he sighed, a long, low sound that said more than words could. "This isn't cosmetic work," he murmured. "This is structural interference. Whoever authorized this should have known better." Daniel flinched. Tessa looked away. The inspector finished his walkthrough and stepped into the living room, wiping his hands on his clipboard. "I'll be filing a report within 48 hours. There's significant damage. Repairs to restore original condition will not be cheap." "How much?" Daniel's voice came out thin. "A rough estimate?" The inspector glanced at me first because legally, I was the only one who mattered. "Somewhere around 30 to 40,000. Tessa let out a quiet gasp. Daniel's jaw clenched. The officer beside him added, "Until this is resolved, you cannot resume any work on this property. Any violation of the order will result in fines." No one spoke for a long moment. The house creaked with the weight of the wind. Dust drifted from a half-demolished beam like falling snow. When the officials finally stepped outside to their vehicles, Tessa turned to me with a trembling voice. "You're punishing us," she whispered, "for trying to build a life here." I met her eyes, not with anger, but with the steadiness of someone who had finally reached her limit. "I'm protecting my life here," I said, "the one I already built."